Well, thank you for that amazing introduction. I was standing backstage with bated breath, hoping he wouldn't go into more florid and lurid things. But Dan is a wonderful poet, and he is at least as good a cook as he is a poet. He's actually fantastic at both. And he's a wonderful editor, and I've been working with Dan off and on, mostly on now for most of my life, it seems. So I'm really very happy to be here. A number of people sort of going around with giddy grins on our faces because we're from upstate New York, north of Buffalo. And we are so happy not to be in the snow belt. It's enough just to make you sort of skip around and chuckle. And it's particularly wonderful to be here, of all places in the United States right now. So thank you, everyone who is part of this wonderful festival. It is certainly the #1 festival. I think it was the first festival that I ever went to in North America. I've been to Edinburgh, which is quite vast, and this is very special and very wonderful. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to be reading part of a story from my new collection, which is called Lovely, Dark, and Deep, with a very nice cover. Dan is my editor, and he had a lot to do with the cover. We always have interesting experiences with covers, where he sends me some kind of, I think Dan sends me covers just to see whether I'm alert. And these covers are not covers he really means, and so I kind of look at them, and then eventually, out of some sort of dialogue between the two of us, a beautiful cover will always emerge. So this is a collection of stories that have quite a bit to do with love relationships and relationships that are a little bit maybe slant-wise in an erotic sense, and it begins with 16-year-old boy is the protagonist of the first story, and he's the youngest person in the collection. And then a couple stories later, there's like a 19 or 20-year-old boy, and then there are young lovers and slightly older lovers. And the book is so structured that the stories start to change and they become a little more surreal. This story, called Lovely, Dark, and Deep, which is about an interview with Robert Frost, who was 77 at the time of the interview. This is the second story from the end, so it's somebody who's older. And then the last story is a novella called Patricide, which is about a Jewish American writer who has won a Nobel Prize. He's not unlike Saul Bellow or Philip Roth, or even Norman Mailer, sort of a composite figure, and he's about 80 years old. So this, as I said, the collection is so organized that it moves from a relatively young person to older people. And also there's a movement from realism to surrealism, which is typical of my story collections. I begin with stories that are somewhat evidently realistic, and then about 100 pages in, they start to shift a little. And often by the end of the volume, there are surrealist stories. So I'll read for a while, and then I'll be happy to entertain questions from the audience if you have any. Lovely, Dark, Deep. It was in the late summer of 1951, when I was 31 years old and a candidate for a master's degree in English at Middlebury College, that I drove to the Breadloaf Writers' Conference to interview Robert Frost for a special issue of Poetry, Parnassus. Here was the first surprise. The great man was much heavier and much more solid body than I'd anticipated. You wouldn't have called him fat. That would have been insulting and inaccurate. But his torso sat against his shirt like a great udder, and his thighs in summer trousers were middle-aged woman's fleshy thighs. The sensitive young poet face of the photographs, at least the ones I had on my bedroom wall, had coarsened and thickened. Deep lines now bracketed the eyes of it, as if the poet had too often scowled or squinted or winked to suggest the secret wickedness of the words he was uttering. The snowy white hair, so often captured in photographs like ectoplasm, lifting from the poet's head, was thinner than any photograph had suggested, and not so snowy white and disheveled, as if he had only risen days from sleep. The entire face looked larger than you expect a poet's face to look, and the thick jaws were covering in glittering little hairs as if the poet hadn't shaved for a day or two. The eyelids were drooping. "Excuse me, Mr. Frost?" My voice was tentative and apologetic. For here was the great man so suddenly. In my nervous excitement, I'd anticipated walking much farther along the path to the cabin in the woods, the poet's cabin as it was called. I anticipated knocking at a door and waiting for the door to be opened. Surely not by the legendary Robert Frost himself, but by an assistant or secretary. Widowed since 1938, as I had made it a point to know, the poet would not have been protected by a wary wife, at least. Instead, Mr. Frost was awaiting his interviewer inside the cabin on a small porch, slouched in a swing, seemingly dozing, slack-jawed, and a scribble of saliva on his mouth. In the bunched crotch of his baggy old man trousers was an open notebook, and on the floor of the porch was the poet's pencil. He seemed to have drifted into a trance-like sleep in the midst of writing a poem. I felt a stab of excitement at such unexpected intimacy. Gazing upon Robert Frost asleep, and no one knows. The Bread Loaf Writers' Conference, as it was called, was a very busy place at this time of year. There were hundreds of visiting writers, poets, and students of all ages, with a preponderance of well-to-do middle-aged women. But this part of the grounds behind the administrative offices was cordoned off as private. Like an earnest schoolgirl, I was carrying a large straw satchel weighted down with books, tape recorder, notebook, and wallet. Out of this straw satchel came now, quick into my hands, my newly purchased Kodak Hawkeye. For it seemed that Mr. Frost had not heard my voice and had not opened his eyes. In my shaking hands, I positioned the camera, peered through the viewfinder at the shadowy figure within, and dared to press the shutter. Very carefully, then, I wound the film to the next picture. Like stopping to reload a shotgun, such photography was. You did not simply take pictures in rapid succession, as people do now. Each act of picture-taking was deliberate and premeditated. How strangely vulnerable Mr. Frost looked to me, like an older relative, a father, a grandfather whom you might glimpse lying about the house, carelessly groomed and only partly dressed. It was said the poet was vain of his appearance and insisted upon exerting veto power over most photographs of himself. I'd come upon him in this slovenly state between sleep and wakefulness, as in a hypnotic trance. I smiled to think, oh, maybe he's dreaming of an interview who has come to him in stealth. In all, I took 7 surreptitious pictures of the afternoon of Mr. Frost, slack-jawed and dozing on a porch swing. Sold to a private collector, resold to another collector, and one day to be placed in the Robert Frost Special Collections in Middlebury College Library, discreetly cataloged Bread Loaf, August 1951, photographer unknown. Taking Mr. Frost's picture without permission was a bizarre act, I know. I've never done anything remotely like this before in my life. At least, I don't recall. Appropriating something not mine that I believed to be mine, I believed I deserved. Yet all this while I was trembling in dread of Mr. Frost waking and discovering me. Exhilaration coursed through my body like a swift sexual shock. I will steal the poet's soul. It is what I deserve. Excuse me, Mr. Frost, I am Evangeline Fife. I have an appointment with you at 1 o'clock. The elderly poet's eyelids fluttered and blinked open. For a startled moment, he didn't seem to know where he was. Had he been sleeping? Oh, what time was this? Then he saw me, blinking again and rubbing at his eyes. Ah, an attractive young stranger, standing some 10 feet in front of him in the grass, with fine-brushed, pale blonde hair and widened periwinkle blue, worshipful eyes, like a poetry-loving schoolgirl. As a portly peacock might do, quickly the poet took measure of himself, glancing down at his bulky body. His large hands lifted to pat down his disheveled hair and stroke his unshaven jaws, adjust his shirt, where it swelled over his belt buckle. He frowned at me and smiled as a cunning look came into the icy blue eyes. And there emerged as through parted curtains on a brightly lit stage, the New England sage, Robert Frost, of the famed poetry readings. Yes, of course, I've been awaiting you, my dear. You are prompt. But I am prompter, you see, for I am already here. Very like a schoolgirl, I stood before the poet whose gaze moved up and down my body with the finesse of a practiced gem appraiser. It's always an anxious moment before a woman understands the male judgment. Yes, you will do. Mr. Frost was murmuring what a lovely surprise this was that the interviewer for poetry was me. So often the interviewer is beetle-browed and grim, if a young man, and thick-waisted and plain as suet, if female. The poet chuckled mischievously, rubbing his hands together. This was the Yankee sage, yet more beloved than mischievous Yankee sage. A blush rose into my face. Being so complimented at the expense of other, less fortunate interviewers was an ambiguous gift. To accept would be vain, but to seem to decline would be rude. A young female soon learns the slitheringness of accommodation to her male elders by a faint frown of a smile. Yet I had no choice but to murmur an apology. Accept, Mr. Frost, it isn't poetry, but poetry Parnassus. Mr. Frost grunted. He wasn't sure he'd heard of poetry Parnassus. Oh, you will be featured on the cover, Mr. Frost, as I explained in my letter. Still he frowned. A sort of thundering malevolence gathered in his brow. Quickly I said, I mean the entire October issue will be devoted to Robert Frost. This placated the poet to a degree. He'd recovered something of his composure, placing a notebook on the table beside the swing and taking up in a playful manner a red plastic fly swatter. My notebook was open to the first page of questions, carefully transcribed in my neat schoolgirl hand. But before I could begin, the mischievous old man peered at me again and said, "You are a good girl, it seems, Evangeline, I should hope. And what blue eyes! Of the hue of the New England hill, has anyone ever told you?" Did Robert Frost expect me not to know to which of his famous poems he was alluding? Shyly I said, "Except if the heal-all is white, Mr. Frost." "Ah, you're quite correct, my dear." The oblique flirtatiousness of the virgin poetess had taken Mr. Frost somewhat by surprise. An ideal opportunity. The poet was gazing at me as if hoping to be surprised further. And so, in my low, thrilled schoolgirl voice, I recited that brilliant, chilling poem that begins, "I saw a dimpled spider." If you had ears to hear, you could detect in interstices of the schoolgirl breathlessness something very far from school or girlishness. At the conclusion of my recitation, Mr. Frost laughed and took up the fly swatter, striking the porch railing in raucous applause. He couldn't have been more delighted if a small child had recited his poem without the slightest idea of its meaning. "That is my most wicked sonnet, my dear. I'm frankly surprised that you would have memorized it." I responded that design was a perfectly executed Petrarchan sonnet which I had memorized as a schoolgirl years ago, before I understood it. "And do you feel you understand it now, dear Evangeline?" Thinking, you little fool, trained in poetry by spinster school teachers, what do you know of me? I was reluctant to take up this challenge. In my dampened undergarments, I sat with meek lowered eyes turning over a page of my notebook, while on the table an alarm clock continued a relentless tick, 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 tick. In a more serious tone, Mr. Frost said, "In great poetry there is always something signatory, a word, a phrase, a break in rhythm, a stanza break that is unexpected. No ordinary versifier could come up with it. In Emily Dickinson's work, virtually every poem contains the signatory element. In Robert Frost's work, it's to be hoped that many poems do. For you see, my dear, in reciting the poem, you blundered with one word, wayside. Instead, you recalled the more commonplace roadside." "Oh, was this so?" I tried to recall, confused. Roadside, wayside. The poet said more kindly than chiding, "If you can't sense the difference between the two words, you are not sensitive to the higher calculus of poetry." "Oh, Mr. Frost, I'm sorry. It was a silly mistake." "Oh, it was not a silly mistake, but a mistake of the sort most people would make, trying to recall a perfect poem." Of course, you could not recall, my dear Evangeline, because you could not have written the poem, as you could not emulate the conditions that give rise to the poem originally. Quote, a lump in the throat, a sense of wrong, a homesickness, a love sickness. The poet seems satisfied now. Mr. Frost was a sort of bully, very familiar to girls and women, who is fond of his victim even as he is contemptuous of her, whose fondness for her may well be an expression of his contempt, like teasing. He lay back in the swing, fingers folded over his Buddha belly. I resumed the interview with a friendly, familiar sort of question. Mr. Frost, will you tell the readers of Poetry Parnassus what you hope to convey in your poetry? Mr. Frost laughed derisively. If I hoped to convey something, Miss Fife, I would send a telegram. Oh, very good. I laughed and wrote this down. In my schoolgirl fashion, I went through a list of questions aimed to draw from the poet quotable quotes which would be valuable to readers of Poetry Parnassus, virtually all of them poets themselves. Pleasurably, Mr. Frost leaned back, his hands locked behind his neck, stretched and yawned, and answered my question in his New England drawl, which was both self-mocking and sincere. Countless times the great poet had been interviewed. Countless times he'd answered those very questions, which he'd memorized, as he'd memorized his thought-out replies. Unlike other poets who would have been restless and irritable and bored being asked familiar questions, Mr. Frost seemed to bask in the familiarity, indeed, like a Buddha who never tires of being worshipped. How different this slack-faced old man was from the dreamy-eyed poet in his early 20s on my bedroom wall. Long ago, he'd composed his aphoristic replies, worn smooth now as much-handled stones. Free verse, quote, playing tennis without a net. Poetry, quote, a momentary stay against confusion. Lyric poetry, quote, ice melting on a hot stove. Love, quote, an irresistible desire to be irresistibly desired. On invitations to poetry festivals. If I'm not the show, I don't go. Opinion of rival Amy Lowell, a fake. Opinion of rival T.S. Eliot, a fake. Opinion of rival Ezra Pound, a fake. Opinion of rival Archibald MacLeish, a fake. Opinion of rival Wallace Stevens, bric-a-brac fake. Opinion of rival Carl Sandburg, hayseed fake. Always strumming his guitar. Everything about Sandburg is studied except his poetry. From time to time, the Vedic voice took on a sound of Olympian melancholy, as a god might meditate upon the folly of humankind from above. Everything I've learned about life can be summed up in 3 words. It goes on. Yet even these somber reflections the poet presented to the interviewer as one might hold out in the palm of his hands the most exquisite little gems. And what is poetry, Mr. Frost? Poetry is what is lost in translation. Mr. Frost paused and then continued thoughtfully. A poem is a stream of words that begins in delight and ends in wisdom. But as it is poetry and not prose, it is a kind of music, a matter of sound and ear. I hear everything I write. This I took up with a canny little query. Do you mean that you hear literally, Mr. Frost, words in your head? Mr. Frost frowned. Though he liked very much to be listened to, he did not like to be queried. I speak aloud to myself. The poem is a matter of measured syllables, iambics, for instance, that produce a work of poetry. Abruptly he ceased. What sense did this make? The young woman interviewer was gazing at him so avidly with her wide and heel-all blue eyes, it had become just subtly disconcerting. A poem is sound over sense? No, a poem is not sound over sense, not my poetry. The babbling of that pretentious prig Tom Eliot might qualify, or infantile lowercase E.E. Cummings, but not the poetry of Robert Frost. And again, candidly I ask, do you ever hear voices, Mr. Frost, as you're composing your poems? Mr. Frost frowned, the large jaws clenched, the look of something like fright came into the faded blue eyes. No, I did not ever hear voices. The poet is not, as Socrates seemed to believe, in the grip of a demon. The poet is in control of the demon. Oh, but there's a demon? No, there's not a demon. That's a way of speaking metaphorically. Poetry is the speech of metaphor. Mr. Frost was frowning at me dangerously, yet I persisted with my innocently naive questions. But Mr. Frost, what is metaphor? And why is metaphor the speech of poetry? The poet snorted with a sort of derision that would arouse gales of laughter in an admiring audience. Miss Fife, you might as well ask a mockingbird why he sings as he does, appropriating the songs of other birds, as ask a poet why he speaks as he does. If you have to ask, my dear girl, it may be that you're incapable of understanding. This scathing rejoinder would have eviscerated another, more subtle interviewer, but did not deter me, for I felt the truth of the poet's observation and did not resent it. But you have never heard voices and you never claimed to have second sight? I pressed these issues, for I knew that Mr. Frost would not volunteer any truth about himself that might detract from his image of the homespun New England bard. Miss Fife, I've told you, no. And you've never had second sight? Scornfully, Mr. Frost said, what is second sight? The ability to see into the future, Mr. Frost, to feel premonitions, to prophesize. Mr. Frost snorted in derision. In his eyes there was a small flicker of alarm. Old wives' tales, my dear, maybe in your Scots family, but not in mine. Adding then in a smaller voice, why would anyone want to see into the future? That would be a curse. In the elderly poet's face, an expression of such pain, loss, grief, and even terror of what cannot be spoken. I looked aside for a moment in embarrassment, thinking, but he is just an old, lonely man. It is mercy he deserves, not justice. And for that moment, thinking perhaps I would take pity on him, beginning by destroying the humiliating snapshots in my camera. Then Mr. Frost resumed his bemused, chiding, superior masculine voice. Miss Fife, tell your avid readers that poetry is very mystery, quite above the heads of all, no matter what the poet tries to tell you. But readily I countered, yet the poet builds upon predecessors. Who have been your major influences, Mr. Frost? Mr. Frost looked at me startled, as if a child had reared up to confront him. My influences? Very few. Life has been my influence. But not Thomas Hardy? No. Not Keats, not Shelley, not Wordsworth, not William Collins? No, not to the degree that life has been my influence. The thundering look in Mr. Frost's face warned me not to pursue this line of questioning, for of all sensitive issues, it is influences that most rankle and royal even the greatest geniuses. Like the suggestion that others have helped them crucially in their careers. Yet I couldn't resist asking why Frost had such a low opinion of Ezra Pound, who'd been so generous to him when he'd been a struggling, unpublished young poet, and they first met in England. Mr. Frost shut his eyes and shook his head vigorously, no comment. But was Ezra Pound mistaken or some sort of fake when he said that A Boy's Will contained the best poetry written in America in a long time? Mr. Frost's eyes remained shut, but his large, lined face sagged in expression of regret. Well, even a fake can be correct now and then. Cautiously, he opened one of the faded blue eyes, his gaze fixed upon me in mock appeal, as a clock that can't keep time is yet correct twice each 24 hours. Still, I wasn't to be placated. My next question was a sharp little blade to be inserted into the fatty flesh of the poet between the ribs. But, Mr. Frost, weren't you once a friend of Ezra Pound? Miss Fife, why are you tormenting me with Pound? The man is a traitor to poetry, as he was a traitor to his country, a fascist fool, an ingrate. No one can estimate when he became insane. He's insane now. Enough of Pound. And what is your opinion of Franklin Delano Roosevelt? Oh, this is a sly question. For Mr. Frost's Yankee conservatism was well known. Even more than Ezra Pound, FDR enraged the poet who stammered in indignation. That cripple, that socialist fraud. FDR's brain was as deformed as his body. He tried to hide the fact that he wasn't a whole man the idiot voters were taking in. And his wife, homely as the backside of a gorilla. Socialism is plain theft, taking from those of us who work and work damn hard and giving what we earn in dollars to idlers and shirkers. My wife, Eleanor, a sensitive, educated woman, nonetheless raved about FDR, that if she could, she would have killed him. Which suggests the man's monstrousness that he would provoke a genteel woman like Eleanor Frost to such rage. You may call me selfish, Miss Fife. Yes, I am a selfish artist, for I believe that art must be self-generated and has nothing to do with the collective. Doing good is a lot of hokum. I would not give a red cent to see the world improved. For if it were, here Mr. Frost's voice quavered coyly, for he'd made this remark many times before, what in hell would we poets have to write about? My shocked response was expected too. Why, Mr. Frost, you can't mean that. Can't I? I certainly do, dear Evangeline. Have you not read my poem, Provide, Provide? In a nutshell, here is Frost's economic theory. Provide for yourself, even if it means selling yourself. Bought in friendship is better than none. The chuckle came deep and deadly. Just don't expect me to provide for you. But you are acquainted with poverty, Mr. Frost, aren't you? Quite extreme poverty? No. No? Not even when you were a child and later when you were married and trying to support a young family on your grandfather's farm and dairy? No. The Frosts were frugal, but we were not ever poor. When your father died in San Francisco, your mother was not left destitute? Miss Fife, destitute is an extreme word. I think that you are insulting my family. This line of questioning has come to an end. Mr. Frost's face was flushed with indignation. He'd been striking the swing street beside him with a fly swatter, as if he'd like to be striking me. You don't think that we have a moral duty to take care of others? Didn't Wordsworth feel that way? Wordsworth. What did Wordsworth know? The old windbag didn't have to contend with our infernal IRS tax, Miss Fife. He did not have to contend with the slimy New Deal. Between us, there was an agitation of the air. Seeing that the poet was about to banish me, having lost patience with even my wanly, blonde, good girl looks, I plunged boldly head on. Is it true, Mr. Frost, that as a young man not yet married, you were so depressed you tried to commit suicide in the dismal swamp of North Carolina? Mr. Frost's cheeks belled in indignation. Dismal swamp? Who's been telling you such slander? It is not true. Didn't you suspect that Eleanor had been unfaithful to you, and so you wanted to punish her and yourself in a romantic gesture? Ridiculous. It's for effete poets like Hart Crane to commit suicide, or utter fakes or failures like Chatterton and Vachel Lindsay, not whole-minded poets. A man with a wife and a family to bind him to the earth doesn't go gallivanting off and kill himself. But your poems are filled with images of darkness and destruction, Mr. Frost. The woods that are lovely, dark, and deep. Except the poet has promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep. Well, the poem is obviously about a yearning to die, but a resistance to that yearning and a regret over the resistance. This is balderdash, Miss Fife. Though you are a pretty lass, you are also a hysterical female. Reading into poems nasty little messages that aren't there, like looking into a mirror and seeing a snake-headed female who is there and who has your secret face. Vehemently the poet spoke, and not very coherently. This face swelled and throbbed as with incipient stroke. Yet I persisted. Why don't you ever read your dark poems to audiences, Mr. Frost? Why only your perpetual favorites, which audience has memorized in school? Are you afraid they will be offended by the darker, more difficult poems and wouldn't applaud you as usual? Wouldn't give you standing ovations that so thrill your heart and buy your books in such great numbers? Flush-faced, Mr. Frost told me I had no idea what I was saying. And I better turn off the damn tape recorder or he would smash it. Enough. This ridiculous interview is concluded. I suggest you leave now, exactly the way you crept in. Yet boldly I asked Mr. Frost about his patriotic poem of 1942, The Gift Outright, with its remarkable line, quote, "The land was ours before we were the land's." Could you explain to the readers of Poetry Parnassus what this astonishing statement means? Mr. Frost had taken up the dingy red plastic fly swatter, tapping restlessly against the swing railing. His voice was heavy with sarcasm. Assuming the readers of Poetry Parnassus can comprehend English, I see no reason to explain a single word. Mr. Frost, this is indeed a provocative statement. Damn you, Fife, what are you getting at? Frost is not provocative. Frost is consoling. Audiences have loved The Gift outright, whether they understand it or not. The poem tells us that our ancestors who settled the New World were of the land in a way that later generations can't be, because we are American citizens, and that the land, our country America, is a gift outright. It is ours. Seeing the expression in my face, which was one of utter transparency, the poet said irritably, is it each individual word that perplexes you, Miss Fife, or their collective meaning? Mr. Frost, the collective meaning of your poem seems to endorse manifest destiny, the right of American citizens to claim all of North America virtually. It totally excludes Native Americans, the numerous tribes of Indians who lived in North America long before the European settlers arrived, British, Spanish invaders, Caucasians. Mr. Frost cast me a look of glaring incredulity. Miss Fife, for God's sake, are you seriously suggesting that Indians are Native Americans? Yes, they're human beings, aren't they? Human, but primitive. Beings, but closer to the animal rung of the ladder than to our own. Mr. Frost tapped the fly swatter on his knee with a dangerous squint of his eye. You may put this in your interview, Miss Fife, that Robert Frost believes in civilization, which is to say, the Caucasian civilization. But Mr. Frost, the indigenous people you call Indians were the original Native Americans. Caucasian from the British Isle and from Europe came to this continent as settlers, explorers, and tradesmen, with no respect for the Native Americans living here. They appropriated the land, exploited and attempted genocide against the natives, and are doing so even now in less obscure, obvious ways in many parts of the country. And your poem, The Gift Outright, which might have addressed this issue with a poet's sharp eye instead, smirking, Mr. Frost interrupted with a sharp slap of the fly swatter. Miss Fife, genocide is a pretty highfalutin term for what the brave settlers did. Conquered the wilderness, established a decent civilization. But there was not a wilderness here. There were Indian civilizations living on the land. Of course, the original inhabitants were not city dwellers. They lived in nature. But surely they had their own civilizations different from our own. How surprised Mr. Frost was by the passion with which I spoke. You might have thought, as Mr. Frost was possibly thinking, that there was something not quite right about this interviewer from Poetry Parnassus. Mr. Frost, is it possible that your audiences have been deceived and that you aren't a homespun New England bard, but something very different? An emissary from dark places, an American poet who sees and defends the very worst in us without apology. In fact, with a kind of pride. And what is wrong with pride, Miss Fife? A fierce light shone in the poet's faded eyes. His breath came audibly and harshly. You could sense the old and large heart beating in his chest, like a maddened fist as in the throes of a combative sexual encounter at which the poet, in his maleness, did not intend to fail. But the interviewer was suffused with a sort of ferocity, too, squaring her slender shoulders and leaning forward, daring to inquire, in her thrilled voice that hardly seemed the voice of a young virginal woman. Did you not once say, Mr. Frost, imagine that your remark wouldn't be recorded, that you would have liked never to see your children again, those who were living at the time and causing you so much trouble? They are accursed. I did not say that. Who's been spreading such lies? I did not. You've written about this in your sly-coded poems, your inability to feel another's pain, your inability to touch another person. You revealed everything in your poems that has been hidden in your heart. which is why in public you deny your very poems, as one might deny paternity to a deformed or disfigured child. This is false. This is wrong. I've tried to explain. Mr. Frost drew a deep breath. Quote, to be too subjective with what an artist has managed to make objective is to come upon him presumptuously and render ungraceful what he in the pain of his life had faith he'd made graceful. Primly, Mr. Frost uttered these words, as if the statement should be sufficient to convince the interviewer, but this statement did not have the desired effect. Mr. Frost, what do those words even mean? That those who see in your poetry something of the terribly flawed and dishonest man who wrote the poems are charged with being ungraceful, while the poet who feeds like a vampire upon the lives of others is imagined as being graceful? But that's what poetry is. Oh, not all poetry, not all poets. The subject today is you. I have no reply to that, miss. The fly swatter had fallen from the poet's fingers to the ground. Whoever you are and wherever you are from, hell. But do you believe in hell, Mr. Frost? I think I do. I must. I believe. This is hell, nor am I out of it. That grim and beautiful line of Marlowe's, I do believe. This concession, rare for the poet, failed utterly to placate the interviewer, who pursued her panting query like a huntswoman and showed him no mercy. Mr. Frost, do you remember when your daughter Leslie was 6 years old? When you were still a young man, a young father, living on that wretched farm in Derry, New Hampshire, you wakened your daughter with a loaded pistol in your hand, and you forced the terrified child to come downstairs in her nightgown to the kitchen where the child saw her mother seated at the table, her hair in her face, weeping. Your wife had been an attractive woman once, but living with you in that desolate farmhouse, enduring your moods, your rages, your sloth, your fumbling incapacity as a farmer, your sexual bullying and clumsiness. Already at the age of 31, she'd become a broken, defeated woman. You told the child, Leslie, she must choose between her mother and her father, which of you was to live and which to die. Quote, by morning, only one of us will be alive. No, that did not happen. It did not. Oh, but Leslie remembers it vividly and will reproach you with the memory through your life, Mr. Frost. Is she mistaken? My daughter, yes, is mistaken. My eldest daughter hates me without knowing me. She has never understood me. And what of your daughter Irma, committed to a mental hospital? Why did you give up on Irma when you might have helped her more? Were you exasperated and disgusted by her as an extreme form of yourself, your wild talk, your turbulent mood, your dark places? You gave up on Irma as you'd given up on your sister Jean years before. Mental illness frightens you like a contagion. Mr. Frost protested weakly. I did all that I could for Irma and for my sister Jean. I could not be expected to give up my entire life for them, could I? All that I'd done they felt no gratitude for, but were encouraged in their wildness and blame of me. Why was poor Irma so obsessed with being kidnapped and raped, forced into prostitution? You were scornful of Irma's terrors. You told her bluntly when she was just a girl, she was so unattractive, she needn't fear being raped. No man would be interested in her sexually. She wasn't worth 20 cents a throw. Later to Robert Lowell, you said laughingly that Irma Frost couldn't have, quote, made a whorehouse. Oh, that is not true. That's a lie. Lowell was a sick, distressed person. I spoke to him in a way to lift his spirits, to entertain him. He thought that he was bad, but old Frost was badder. But none of it was meant to be taken literally. And your son, your only surviving son, he'd said, my father's ashamed of me. My father has no more than glanced at my poetry and pushed it aside. He'd said, sometimes I feel tight-strung like a bow. I feel that I must be shot straight to the heart of. And your son's voice would trail off, and he would hide his face in his hands. The interviewer spoke in a soft, condemning voice. The poet stared at her. Small hairs stirred at the nape of his neck. It was very hard for him to draw a breath. Who is he? Who are you talking of? In desperation, he snatched up the poetry notebook in both hands as if to shield himself with it. Mr. Frost, you know your son burnt his poetry. 15 years of poems. You had thought so little of him, you'd never give him permission to live. He was always your son. You never relinquished him, though you never loved him. He was 38 when he died of a gunshot wound to the head. He'd seemed much younger, as if he never lived. All he wanted was approval from you, a father's blessing, but you withheld it. I've told you, I don't know who you're talking about. Your son, Mr. Frost, your son Carol, who killed himself. My son did not kill himself. He died of a regrettable accident. Your son you named with a ridiculous girl's name for some whim of yours. He was so unhappy with Carol, he changed it to Carol, to your displeasure. It was too late, the damage had been done. As a young child, he'd been marked. In his poetry, he wrote of how you'd sucked the marrow out of his bones. You left him nothing. You'd taken his manhood from him. He knew your secret. You could never love any of your children. You could love only yourself. Frost shook his massive head from side to side. I loved Carol, he knew. You never told him you loved him, he didn't know. Carol was weak, immature. He was not a man. How then could he write genuine poetry? He was a versifier. His best poems were pale imitations of mine. He was a child who traced drawings in Crayola. His rhymes were stolen from mine. Though, snow, slow, near, sear. Worse were his poems in which he attempted free verse. Mr. Frost laughed a ghastly wheezing sound. With the verve of a litigator arguing his case, he spoke with a righteous sort of confidence. My son thought that no one loved him. Pitiful. His mind was one cloud of suspicion. His cloud became our cloud. Well, he took his cloud away with him. We never gave him up. He ended it for us, the protracted misery and obstinacy of a failed life. A brooding moment, and then it was an error to marry, initiating a sequence of worse errors, the false Frost children. Soon it came to me, though I thought I kept it a secret, that I didn't care in the slightest if I ever saw any of them again, at least after my dear daughter Margaret died. She I did love. Yet what good was my love? I could not save the beautiful girl. She died as a child of anyone might have died, a disappearance. Quote, the only sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. Nothing more in nature than that of grief. A poet ought not to marry and procreate. That was the fear of my wife Eleanor. She would drag me down into her mortality, and we would make each other miserable, which we did. Poetry is more than enough for procreation. Life is the raw material like dough, but it's only raw, and it's only dough. No one cares to eat mere dough. The poet's large, slack-jawed face contorted into a look of sheer disdain. Astonishingly, he reared up on his legs that barely held his bulk. The notebook fell from his lap onto the grass. Like a wounded bull, suffused with an unexpected strength by pain and outrage, the poet swayed and glared at his tormentor. He was stricken to the heart, but he would not succumb. His enemies had assailed him cruelly and shamefully as they had through his beleaguered life, but he would not succumb. You, whoever you purport to be, an interviewer for a third-rate poetry journal, what do you know of me? You may know scattered facts about my life, but you don't know me. You haven't the intelligence to comprehend my poems any more than a blind child could comprehend anything beyond the braille she reads with her fingertips. Only just the raised words and nothing of the profound silence that surrounds the words. Taken by surprise, the young blonde interviewer stumbled to her feet also, a deep flush in her face. She backed away with a look of surprise and alarm. Jabbing at this adversary with his forefinger, the enraged poet charged, you are nothing. People like you don't exist. You've never been called the greatest American poet of the 20th century. You've never won a single Pulitzer Prize, let alone several Pulitzer Prizes, and you never will. You have never roused audiences to tears, to applause, to joy. You've never roused audiences to the feeling homage to your genius. Barely you are qualified to kiss the hem of genius. All you can do, people like you, contemptible little people, spiritual dwarfs, is to scavenge in the ruins of the poet's life without grasping the fact that the poet's life is of no consequence to the poet, essentially. You snatch at the dried and outgrown skin of the snake. The husk of his skin the living snake will cast off as he moves with lightning speed out of your grasp. You fail to realize that only the poetry counts, the poetry that will prevail long after the poet has passed on, and you and your ilk are gone and forgotten utterly, as if you never existed. The poet stumbled down the porch steps, not quite seeing where he was going. Something glaring was exploding softly. The sun? Overhead, an agitated wind in the trees. He had banished her, the demon. His deep creased face was contorted with rage. The blue eyes were sharpened like ice picks. In the grass, the poet's legs failed him. He began to fall. He could not break the propulsion of his fall. It brought him heavily to the ground. All his life he'd been eluding the petty demons that picked at his ankles, his legs, the petty demons that whispered curses to him that he was bad, he was wicked, he was cruel, he was himself. All his life they'd tried to elicit him to injure himself, as his only surviving son Carol had injured himself and succumbed to madness. In the vast reaches of the dismal swamp, he'd first seen the demons clearly and retained the vision through the decades. How in daylight it's a temptation to forget the terrible wisdom of the swamp, but at great peril. He had blundered this time, but he had escaped. He was not going mad, but madness swept through him like a powerful emetic. Somehow he was lying in the grass. Gnats flung themselves against his damp eyes. He'd fallen from a great height like a toppled statue. His fury was choking him like a towel stuffed down his throat. He would grab hold of the damn clock and throw it, but the taunting girl interviewer had vanished. His notebook, precious notebook, it had slipped from his fingers. He strained to reach it, to hold against his chest. Strangely, it seemed, he was bare-chested so suddenly. The shame of his soft, slack torso was exposed to all the world. He could not call for help. The shame was too deep. The poet was not ever a weakling to call for help. The obstinacy of his aging flesh had been a source of great frustration to him and shame, but he had not succumbed, and he would not. Just barely the poet managed to seize hold of a corner of the notebook. The strain of reaching caused him to tremble, yet he managed to draw the notebook to him and to press it against his chest. His loud thumping heart would be protected from harm, from the assault of his enemies. For here was his shield, as in antiquity. The warrior has fallen, but is shielded from the pain of mortality. Mr. Frost, oh, Mr. Frost! Already they'd found him. He had scarcely time to rest. He was unconscious, but breathing. The great poet fallen in wild grass in front of the poet's cabin at Breadloaf, Vermont, in a late afternoon in August 1951. Yet the poet was breathing. No mistaking this, the poet was breathing. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you very much. Well, I'll be happy to take a few questions, if you have any questions. There's a microphone. I got in quite a bit of trouble for writing this story because people who like Robert Frost, the Robert Frost estate and some of his relatives thought that it was a cruel and erroneous portrait of him, but I really meant him to be like a really great, complicated, deep and difficult person, a person of genius. Yes.
Hi, I'm in a book club, and it's been in existence for 40 years, over 40 years, and I remember that we read your book because it is bitter and because it is my heart, and I wanted to know what year it was, but it influenced me because every time I go to a restaurant and the host leads us to a table, I think of you because I think in the book, one of the characters sat with his back towards the door and got shot, and his son never wanted to do that.
Well, I think that's a different novel. That was what I lived for.
What I lived for.
That's the
so
other novel. Did
you write both of those books?
Yes.
Okay. So anyway, I want you to know I think of you when I go and get seated in a restaurant. So that's what I lived for.
Okay,
it was very good. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm not sure if that was. I guess that was a question.
And it was
Yes, I wrote both the books.
And it was it took place in Albany, right?
Pardon me?
All your books take place in Albany.
None of them do.
Or upstate New York?
Well, some of them take place in upstate New York. Albany is William Kennedy's territory. And then the mountains, Adirondack Mountains, are sort of Russell Banks' territory. But then I have
Yes.
Western New York State.
Well, we look forward to reading more of them.
Thank you.
Hello. About
Hi.
20-something years ago, I had the privilege of hearing you at a Flannery O'Connor symposium in Milledgeville, Georgia. I don't know if you remember
yes.
that or not. And I was wondering if you could just talk a moment about the influence of Flannery on your life, because as an 18-year-old, I did not have enough experience to appreciate the things you said then. So if you could just touch on that.
Well, the question of influence is very interesting. I think that Flannery O'Connor was influenced by some of the same people that I was influenced by. She was extremely influenced by Nathaniel West, for instance, and she was extremely influenced by Eudora Welty, and in a way by Faulkner. She wanted to avoid being influenced by Faulkner, but I think all the Southern writers were. And so, I mean, I really read all those. I read all those writers, and she's one of them, you know. So I think it's something like that. She's a great writer. Yes.
Hi. So I'm with Young Arts. I'm an alumna of the organization, which is that helped present this evening, which has been wonderful. And it helps recognize and nurture young artists, usually 15 to 18 years old, because we want them to keep making work. These artists that have so much potential. So for you, what has been, since you have been making work for such a long time, the most significant thought or motivation to keep making art and sharing that with the world?
Well, basically, I think writers like to write, you know, painters like to paint, musicians like to work with music. I don't think that one has to have a principle or, you know, a sort of saying on the wall. You basically are doing what you like to do, and people have many things in their hearts that, many stories that need to be told, that they need a language to tell. So, I mean, I don't think I'm any different from most other people.
Awesome. Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your words with us tonight. I would love to hear about if you have any kind of specific writing rituals that you follow, and how when you're working through like the initial stages of an idea, you're able to turn off that kind of editor hat or inner critic to really push through and see if an idea actually has merit and potential.
Well, it's a kind of complicated question. Writing rituals, I think, well, Dan Halpin, who introduced me so graciously, said that I usually have a cat in the room. I really have always had cats. I grew up on a small farm in upstate New York, as I keep mentioning upstate New York, a small farm that was not very prosperous, but we had a lot of barn cats. And so somehow cats have always been with me. And so people ask me how I work so many hours a day and why I write so much. It's actually because my cat Cherie, who does tweets, maybe some of you, she does, especially when I'm not there. I think right now she's doing some Twitter, sending out incendiary things on Twitter. But she sits in my lap, and because she's sleeping or she doesn't want to be disturbed, if I try to get up too soon, like after only 1 hour or 2 hours, she puts her claws in because she wants to sleep longer. So therefore, I just have to stay working much longer. Like, you know, if I didn't have the cat, I'd probably be up and down all the time. If I didn't have the cat, I'd be a poet. The poets scribble these little things, you know, these little masterpieces, then they kind of run out and do other things. But if you're a novelist, you're like a long-distance trucker where you write, as Richard Ford said, we write to the very end of the edge of the page, and then we go back and we write there. It's not like the little poem in the middle of the page. And if we're paid more than poets, it's because we do this sort of long distance. So my advice is to get a nice kitty with claws and a nice deep purr.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, yes, Joyce. My name is Dr. Pat O'Doherty, and I've always liked the kind of acuteness of your writing. What role has your own personal suffering played in kind of expressing your thoughts in this acute cutting, incisive way. How do you draw on suffering, your own suffering, to motivate it?
There's a difference between, is it cuteness or acuteness? As if there's acute. Oh, I thought it was cute. Okay. Well, anyway, I have two. I'm like Robert Frost with all these ready answers. Acuteness, I don't know. I guess it's just a person's personality, and maybe because I was brought up in a kind of hardscrabble world, my family didn't have a lot of money. We didn't have any books, and I guess I just became somebody for whom the written word or the idea of a book was just so special. Since we didn't have books, I went to a one-room schoolhouse. And so everything that I think maybe many people take for granted, which is quite natural that you would, but if you're from a background where you didn't have any of that, it's very precious. So to me, the idea of a book, particularly exemplified by Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass, my first book, which is a beautiful children's book, it just became very sacred to me. It still has a kind of a luminous, shimmering quality to it, the idea of a book. And so I don't feel that the online writing is anything like, a book with a nice cover. So that's a different kind of consciousness.
Thank you. It's like you completed an incompleteness theorem in that, but I did like the response. It was an unusual response. I also love Alice in Wonderland. Four
Yes.
worlds, fantasy and childhood and magic and dreams come together in her
Yes.
works in odd connections, don't they? A lot of different tangents come together in Alice in Wonderland.
Yes, and
Well,
it's for a child, it's like a glimpse into another world. It's not just a children's book, but a look into an adult world, Darwinian evolutionary theory and nightmare and so forth.
unfinished syllogisms. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi, my name is Michael. I was just saying that one of my favorite works you wrote was Blonde, and it kind of fits into what you read tonight because you take these enigmatic, infamous figures that are known maybe differently in the mainstream, and you've kind of complicated and given complexity that would not be known or maybe thought about by the general public. And I was just curious what influences you to create these backgrounds for figures that maybe most people don't usually consider.
Well, Blonde is a novel that I think I worked the hardest on in my entire life. Not all of it was, it wasn't easy writing. I'm feeling very stressed and very anxious about it. Sort of all tied up with my father becoming quite ill and eventually dying. And then Marilyn Monroe, Blonde, I should have explained, is about Norma Jean Baker, who becomes Marilyn Monroe. And of course, she dies at the relatively young age of 36. And so when I was working on the novel, I didn't have the openness and freedom that we have in fiction, because she did die when she was 36, and there was no way that I could get away from that. I just thought that when I saw pictures of Norma Jean Baker, she looked so quintessentially American. She looked just like a girl, could be just, and we went high school girl, the girl next door. She had brown hair. She wasn't so beautiful at one point in her life. And so Hollywood kind of took her and made her into this commodity. She becomes like the quintessential female that's a commodity and mass-produced ultimately. So that's such a common picture of Marilyn Monroe is that Andy Warhol's silkscreen, which shows her very vulgar with her face almost distorted and her hair very obviously bleached. In other words, the living girl, who at one point was just a sweet girl, is just made over into this mass-produced essence and made millions and millions and billions of dollars for other people. But she didn't make that much money herself. You'd be surprised at how relatively little money she made compared to what was made from her. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have really two questions. The first question is, did you get blowback for when you were writing The Cursed about Upton Sinclair and Grover Cleveland? and especially Jack London,
London.
from their families?
Well, the portrait of Upton Sinclair is pretty admiring. I mean, he was very idealistic. And this is my novel, The Accursed. Is Woodrow Wilson is the main character. I didn't get much criticism about these people because the novel is set in 1905, 06, and basically everyone who'd care about these things is no longer living. But my portrait of Jack London is a real portrait. Like the portrait of Robert Frost, that's the way he was. He was mischievous, he was bawdy, he would shock people, he was funny. I mean, that's the way Robert Frost was. He wasn't this old Santa Claus kind of person who was very pious. And so with these people too, Grover Cleveland, well, I made a lot up about that, I must say, Grover Cleveland sees a ghost. I guess I made that up. I had to make up something.
And my second question is, which of your books are your favorites?
Well, I think most writers feel closest to what they've just done. I feel very close to the Robert Frost story, which whenever I read it, just to myself, and it just seems that Robert Frost really said those things. I took all sorts of quotations from him from many parts of his life and sort of put them all together. And he has these wonderful quotes about poetry. But then he says these outrageous things too. His chauvinism and his sexism and his bigotry. I didn't even get into his racism. I mean, I touched a little bit upon it, but he was also, wasn't exactly a friend to desegregation and so forth. He was very conservative. But yes.
Hi.
Better stop.
I had two questions. The first one was, at the end of the what you just read, Robert Frost expresses how his life is not important, but his work is what will stay. Is that also your view? Is your work what's going to stay? And if that's the case, is that why a writer writes? And the second question, you mentioned that your collections are structured in a way that goes from more realistic stuff to surreal. What are the reasons, other than just the effect that it has on the reader?
Well, I can't. You have two questions, right?
Yes.
So, to answer the last one first, I usually begin with stories that are not so difficult. They may be even short. And sometimes they involve young people, though not always. But the first story might be fairly short. And then the stories get a little more maybe complicated, and I'll have 3 or 4 or 5 parts of the book. And sometimes by the time you get to like page 200, the stories are pretty surreal. Like this story actually is a somewhat surreal story. You're supposed to think that Robert Frost has fallen asleep and that he's dreamt this interviewer, and she's his worst nightmare. And like many people, especially in the 19th century, Frost had a real fear of going mad. That's the great fear in Edgar Allan Poe, and I think Herman Melville. We don't seem to have that quite as much anymore, maybe because of psychotropic drugs and antidepressants or whatever. But our ancestors were actually afraid of going mad, and there was a lot of insanity. So that was one thing that struck me about him. And so I structured the books that way because by the time the reader has gotten to the end of the book, he or she is more able to read these more difficult stories. And then your first question, do you want to repeat that?
The idea of the author's work being what is important now.
The life.
The life.
Well, it's a good question, and I've always been so struck, and I think it's a very optimistic thing. When you think of some of the great writers in American literature, for instance, Hemingway, if you know much about his life, you know that he was not really a good person. He had many flaws, and of course he drank a good deal. He was mean to people. He could be quite vicious. And Faulkner and Eugene O'Neill and others. The point I'm making is that their personal life had nothing to do with their art. It's as if Hemingway just climbed up a staircase onto this high level, and he created these beautiful short stories and this beautiful language and a number of profound books. And the same with Faulkner. It's as if they rose up out of their mortal, flawed personalities, and they just created this great art. And when you think about that, it gives you it gives you much hope, because you may be frustrated or impatient with yourself for something that you're not happy about. But if you put your effort into your art, that actually will outlive you, and it won't even necessarily be, touched by your life. That's the one thing that I find in reading biographies. Once in a while, I'm stunned to see that a writer is really good in his life as he is in his art. For instance, Henry James. The later Henry James, when he was quite elderly, you should read how generous he was and wonderful things that he did. There are a number of writers who are very good people, but most of them are very flawed, and it's almost shocking that Faulkner he was such a foolish person. He made up lies about he pretended he was in the Air Force. He just he was like a foolish person. You would never ever think that person would create these great novels in American literature. To me, that's just astonishing, and I think it's quite wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe just one more question?
Thanks.
Yes.
Because you answered it before about the short stories, but I wanted to know about your novels. So something like Niagara Falls or The Gravedigger's Daughter, is that what it's called? Or the one
Yes.
about the ice skating sister? I don't remember the name. I'm
My
sorry.
Sister, My Love.
Okay,
Yeah.
read them all, love them all, and I'm always happy when I get them because I feel I'm going to read something incredibly unique and a great story. And I'm just wondering where the influence for the story comes. Is it like the characters come to you, or the tale comes to you, or do you just put it together, and just about the process?
Well, these are really great questions tonight. It seems that people here are writers, and that you're interested in the technique, which is what writers like to talk about, things like that. Well, it's a really good question. I think what I'm excited about often is the structure and the voice. If I could find a different way of telling a story, that would make me kind of excited. Like I gave an assignment to my students at Princeton, which was due, maybe it was yesterday. God, it was yesterday. I'm traveling so much. Anyway, I thought it was a really interesting assignment. They're to write in the voices of Hemingway, Jack Kerouac, and H.P. Lovecraft, but to tell a story in 3 parts. Like you start off the story, could be Hemingway, and you go into Kerouac, and you might end your story in Lovecraft. So the students had this challenge to write a story in 3 voices, like steps. And they had such a good time, and one or two of them wrote just brilliant. They're just introductory students. They would never have done that without the assignment, but it was really, really interesting. So to me, some kind of concept like that, I find exciting. I never got assignments like that from my teachers. I never got that myself, but I find that my better students just really, really are excited when they get an assignment like that. So My Sister, My Love is a first-person narration with footnotes, and it's a little bit related to a novel that I wrote some years ago called Expensive People, the kind of related together. Then the next novel I have coming out in January or February is called The Sacrifice, and that's a little bit related to my novel Them, which was basically written in 1969 in Detroit, and this other novel is written just last year in New Jersey. So there's something about my wanting to take up themes from the past and change them around and make them somehow contemporary.
So
Then my novel The Accursed I had written, actually completed it in 1984, but then I kept revising it and working on it, so it didn't get finished until 2011. So that's weird.
So I guess it's your gift as a novelist, a storyteller, writer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.